So far, we have finished Daniel chapter 1 and 2. And in Daniel chapter 1, we see that in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, he has defeated the Egyptians in the Battle of Carchemish, and he has marched towards uh, Jerusalem. And this battle that he's been fighting is against Egypt. And Egypt has lost the battle. And we see that Nebuchadnezzar, he is going towards Jerusalem and he besieged Jerusalem. In chapter 1, we see that Nebuchadnezzar has taken some temple treasures and he's also taken some of the royal men and main men of Babylon, of Jerusalem, back to Babylonian. So he has taken the cream of the crop back to Babylon. So what he does is he picks the best men of Judah to serve on his palace staff, and he takes them back to his kingdom along with the vessels, the holy vessels. Then we see that Nebuchadnezzar, he appoints his chief to train these young men. The chief's name is Ashpenaz. Now, Ashpenaz is commanded to give them a daily provision of the food and the wine of the king's own table. Now, in chapter 1, we see 4 members of this group that are singled out. We see Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, all 4 had Jewish names. We see that they are now given Babylonian names. Then we see that these men, even though they were given and inducted into the Babylonian culture, they did not forget their Jewish roots and they did not give in to the Babylonian god or their culture. So, firstly, we see that Daniel and his friends did not accept the king's food and wine. Now, it is not clear as to why Daniel did not, eat the food. Probably the food in Judah had, you know, had to follow some Mosaic laws, and probably these guys did not follow that. Probably the food here was offered to the Babylonian gods. And we don't know the reason, but whatever the reason was, we know that Daniel, he wouldn't, bend for his God. He would go towards his God and not follow the Babylonian, whatever they were following, these pagan things. Then we see that, Daniel, he convinces this guard who was assigned to them. And he says to them that, we'll see for 10 days, you give us, instead of the king's food and wine, give us only vegetable for 10 days. And we'll see in 10 days if we are better. And if we are better, we'll stick to that diet. So the guard, he did not make them eat the king's food. In fact, he gave into their wishes. And we see that in 10 days, these guys were more, special, and they had special wisdom. And Daniel, we see, was able to interpret these visions and dreams. We see that when, um, the training period was over, as in they uh, were trained for 3 years. And after the three years were over, that these guys, these 4 Jewish boys, they were superior to all the others. And we know this from Daniel chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. We see now that was Daniel chapter 1. And as I've said this before, from Daniel chapter 1 to 6 is the stories that happened, in the kingdom. And then from chapter 7 to 12, we have the prophecies of Daniel. So right now we are in the storyline of the book of Daniel. Now in chapter 2, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, during his second year, he has a dream. Okay. Now, in his second year, he has a dream and he thinks that, that these guys cannot interpret his dream. So he he thinks that, if he reveals his dream to these wise men of Babylon, that, they might give him any sort of interpretation. So he makes a request that's very unusual. And the request is that the person interpreting the dream has to tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream also. Like that, he will know that the dream is, you know, that they're giving him the real interpretation. And in that dream, he sees a statue, okay? And let me show you the picture of the statue. The the statue looks like this. The head is made of gold. The chest and the arms are made of silver. The belly and the thighs are made of bronze. And we have the legs made of iron. And fifth, we have a mixture of iron and clay. So he sees the statue and he's very frightful because there's a huge rock that is thrown at the statue and it breaks the statue into pieces. That was Daniel chapter 2. So Daniel interprets the dream, and what he tells Nebuchadnezzar, he tells Nebuchadnezzar that the head is Babylon, the chest and the arms made of silver is the Medes and the Persian, the belly and the thighs are the Greeks, and the iron legs are the Roman Empire. And we see that uh, the legs, they're made of clay also, clay and iron mixture. So that's the fifth. So the Roman, so as you see the statue, the from the head to the toe, the metals decline in nature, and with uh, the value goes down. So the gold being the most important, the head, then the chest and the arms, they were a little bit inferior, and then the bronze a little more inferior, then the iron legs a little more inferior, and then the clay mix. So why is clay mixed with the iron is because Rome was going to be a divided kingdom. And right now we see the United European nations, they're all divided. So this was a prediction made by Daniel, and it was the dream that he interpreted for, for Nebuchadnezzar. So this was chapter 2. And because of this, we see that, that Nebuchadnezzar finds favor in Daniel. So now let's go into chapter 3. In chapter 3, what happens in chapter 3? We see in chapter 3 that the king, he builds an image, okay, and this is a statue, and he builds a statue to test the loyalty of his officials. And we see that Daniel's three friends are present on the scene, but Daniel is nowhere on the scene. What is Daniel doing, and where is Daniel? Daniel in chapter 2, verse 49, it states that Daniel made a request of the king and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylonia, while Daniel remained at the royal court. So we see here as chapter 3 begins that Daniel, he's going to remain where? He's going to remain in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. So let's start in verse 1. Verse 1 says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width was 6 cubits. He set it upon the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So we see that, Nebuchadnezzar, through his dream in chapter 2, he gets an idea that, he is the head of gold. So, he thinks to himself, let's build, a large statue. Now, it is very common for these rulers to build a statue of either of themselves or, their gods. So this was not, uncommon in ancient times. For example, we see the great phoenix, in Egypt. It's still there. It's 240 feet long and 66 feet high. And, it has a lion-like body and human head. And it was constructed in 250, 2500 BC. And it still, has its, glare over the desert sands. We also see other pharaohs, they built large statues for themselves and, placed them all over Egypt. And we see uh, all of this happening, we see them, many movies and, pictures in the past. We have seen all these things. And here we see Nebuchadnezzar, he's no different. He's made an image of gold, and we see that the height was 60 cubits and 6 cubits. So if you look at the dimensions, the height 60 cubits and 6 cubits doesn't, make sense, because 6 cubits is like just 9 feet and 60 cubits is like a 9-story building. So the height is 9 stories and, the base is only 6 cubits. So some scholars believe that, the statue was put on a base, and that base plus the statue included 60 cubits, and it was and with that the base was 6 cubits wide. So if you only think of the statue as being 6 cubits wide, it wouldn't be able to hold the weight of a 9-story building. It had to be on some base. So the base plus the statue was 60 cubits. And Nebuchadnezzar, being of his caliber, he made the image out of gold. Now, in those days, the statues or anything were not made of pure gold. They were plated with gold. It was just a plating on it. uh, for example, we see in Exodus chapter 38, verse 30, the altar is called a bronze altar. Okay. So it was not fully bronze, but it was only overlaid with bronze. And likewise, we also see the gold altar in Exodus 39, verse 38. It was not solid gold, but it was overlaid with gold. We know that from Exodus 30, verse 3. So we see that here there's a statue, and Nebuchadnezzar has erected it with the help of his workers. And probably this is not him that the statue is made. Probably he is dedicated to one of the gods of Babylon, like Marduk, or some other gods like Baal or something. And here we see that this statue was like huge, and it was what the rulers normally did was, the city was in one place and they would build statues just outside the city. Now this was the statue Daniel mentions that was built on the plain of Dura. So Dura, The meaning of Dura is like a walled city. So there was a city just 16 miles south of Babylon called as Dura, and on its plain, the statue was erected. Probably the the size of the statue was so huge that you could probably see it from even the on a clear day, you could probably even see it from Babylonian. So this was where uh, the statue was built. So that was verse 1. Then in verse 2 and 3 it says that Nebuchadnezzar the king sent words sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then verse 3 says, Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So here we see Nebuchadnezzar assembled all the officials of his empire for the dedication of this image. Now, here, if you look at these titles given to these rulers, there are 7 of them, and all are, I believe, all are given to us in, they're listed in beginning with the most prominent or important ones. So first we see the satraps. The satraps were the princes. These were the guys who had to protect the kingdom. They were the highest rulers over the largest divisions of the empire. Then secondly, we see the prefects. These were also high ranking officials, and you were responsible to report everything to the satraps. Then thirdly, we see the governors. The governors were, rulers over a particular district. They were administrators of, the smaller regions. Then we have counselors or advisors. Then we see that there were treasurers, there were judges, like people who would just, dish out justice. And then we have, the magistrates who were like the local police. So the text also says that there were other lesser important dignitaries, and the text says that all the rulers of the province were gathered. So all these government officials were brought out to the plain of Dura, and their loyalty was to be demonstrated to the king by bowing down before the image. So as I've said before, this image was probably not in the likeness of Nebuchadnezzar, uh, because they rarely, put up images of themselves. It is, probably some god. And even though, a king is considered as a high, deity kind of person, sometimes only they would, build statues, but not of this caliber. This caliber kind of statue was built for one of the gods. Then we see in verses 4 to 6, it says that the herald loudly proclaimed in verse 4, to you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, tigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. Then in verse 6, it says, but whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a blazing fire. So, what is a herald? A herald is an officer who just is to proclaim all the announcements. So here we have a herald, and he's making an announcement to all the people who are gathered in the plain of Dura. Now we see that verse 4 indicates that, there are many different nationalities, people, nations, and men of every language were present over there. And we see that this was Nebuchadnezzar's policy. He would appoint all the natives of the provinces to be rulers over them. He would not, uh, you know, uh, he would not put foreigners over the provinces. These were like local guys from those provinces. Now, the local language was Aramaic at that time, so probably, this herald was making the announcement in Aramaic so that, everyone could understand what he's saying. and and that is the way it would have. And after he made the announcement, the orchestra would begin to play. Nebuchadnezzar's orchestra is mentioned over here, all the instruments that were to play. So firstly, we have a horn. So this was, just a animal's horn. It was a wind instrument. It was, made of some animal like a cow. It could have even been like a horn made of, silver, like a trumpet. Then we see that there's a flute. Then there's a lyre or harp, and this was like a Greek instrument. Then uh, we have a tigon, which is a small four-string instrument like a guitar. Then we have a psaltery, and this was a different kind of harp. It was triangular in shape, and it was it was a string instrument, but the strings passed underneath the board, and it consisted of 10 strings. Then we have a bagpipe, which was a wind instrument, and this wind instrument composed of, a goatskin bag with two reed pipes, one for filling the bag with wind from the mouth, and the other pierced with holes for the fingers to provide the various notes. So here we see different instruments, and let me show you how these instruments would probably look. So this is like what the instruments. We have a flute on the right, we have a horn, we have a horn probably made of silver over here. Then we have the psaltery, which is like a string instrument. You see the strings, they are passing from underneath the board. Then we have a tigran. It was like a guitar, but not. Then we have the harp. And and one more picture I want to show you all guys is this one. So as you guys can see, there's a horn, then there's a bagpipe, then there's a lyre, there's a harp, and this isn't mentioned, this instrument drums, but probably there was a hand drum also. And this is a psaltery, the string instrument that this guy is playing. So these were the different instruments, very different from what we have today, but similar. So those were the instruments, and we see that the text also mentions that there were all kinds of music. So this indicates that besides these six instruments, there were other instruments that were in this band or orchestra. So Nebuchadnezzar had the best available music equipment from all over the world in Babylon. So there was this huge orchestra, and at the sound of their music, all the officials were supposed to bow down and worship the image of gold. And and here we see that their loyalty was tested. It was clear that everyone who were on Nebuchadnezzar's side would worship this image. Uh, and no, God honoring Jew would worship this statue. Verse 6 tells us, the penalty for disobeying the king's order. It was announced. What was the penalty? The penalty was that anybody who did not worship the image would be burnt immediately. Now, probably, on the same plane at a distance somewhere, there probably was, a big iron furnace. Okay. And this furnace, in those days, the furnace normally looked like a old, milk bottle. It had a top from where, probably the gold was put in to melt, and at the bottom there was an opening to, to put in the wood to, burn the bricks, to make the bricks ready. So you could make bricks, you could melt gold, and these ovens were like big, like huge. So probably these guys who had gathered for worship of the image could see this oven, and they knew that if we're not going to bow down, the penalty is going to be that we're going to get killed. So this was like, what was the situation? So probably, everybody in the crowd, they feared for themselves, and watching the smoke coming out of that oven would make them even fearful. So this is what was happening. So in verse 7, it says that when, these instruments, it says, therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of these instruments, the people, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had set up. Everyone, followed the commandment of Nebuchadnezzar. But there were exceptions. There were three men that, that stood alone in all this situation. So in verse 8, we see that, the Chaldeans, it says in verse 8, for this reason, certain Jews, Chaldeans, astrologers came forward and brought charges against the Jews. So look at the crowd. The crowd must have been so big that, nobody could recognize these three men. So who are these three men? These were the three friends of Daniel. Okay. So Daniel was back at the palace, and these were the three friends of Daniel. So probably Nebuchadnezzar couldn't, point out these individuals, but there were some people who realized that, these guys are not bowing down, and they were the Chaldeans. As we've seen before, Chaldeans were astrologers, and they were the natives of Babylonia. And, probably we see that, these guys were the jealous kind, because, uh, Daniel and his friends received big uh, leadership positions in this, in this kingdom, while, they have been there for, long years and years, and toiling in the kingdom, and they had no recognition. So, uh, these guys literally, chewed them out, complained about them harshly to Nebuchadnezzar. And they even mentioned to him that, the Jews that you have, uh, made rulers of the kingdom, they don't even respect you. And we see the charges that they brought against these guys. In verse 9, we see that they responded to and said, Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of all these instruments is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Then verse 12, there were certain Jews whom you have appointed. This is the charges over the administration of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. So we see that, these guys, they do not worship the image and replay, refuse to comply. And there is a death sentence on their head. So we see here in these verses that, the astrologers or the Chaldeans emphasize that these Jewish people, these three Jewish boys were disrespectful, you know, even after what, Nebuchadnezzar had done for them. Now, if you look at these verses, there's no reason why they needed, to point out the nationality of these three guys. The only thing that says that probably why they pointed it out is because they had a resentment towards these Jewish people. And as I said earlier, it's probably because, these guys were occupying the positions in the kingdom that they were eyeing for. So, so the king, he was reminded that he had given these Jews positions of authority in his administration. And these Chaldeans stressed on, this Jewish boys' rebellion and insubordination, and they complained to Nebuchadnezzar in that way. Had Nebuchadnezzar made a mistake in assigning these foreign positions to over native Babylonians? So here we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and now they are guilty of the charges brought against them. What were the charges? Number one, they paid no attention to the king. That was probably one of the charges. They did not serve the king's gods. That was another. And they refused to worship the golden statue the king himself had set up. So there were three charges. And what was the penalty? The penalty was death. So then in verse 13, we see Nebuchadnezzar in a rage and anger gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three men. They were brought before the king. Then in verse 14, we see that Nebuchadnezzar questions them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" So here we see a little disbelief from Nebuchadnezzar. He asks these three Jewish boys if, the accusations brought against them were true. Had these three foreigners actually refused to worship the gods of Babylon? So this was a statue that, Nebuchadnezzar himself worshipped. And these guys, to disobey, the king's command, even the king was, in shock. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he makes an offer to these three guys. And this is the offer. In verse 15, he says, "If you are ready at this moment, or the moment you hear the sound of these musical instruments or the orchestra, you bow down, fall down, and worship the image that I have made. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" So for some reason over here, Nebuchadnezzar has a soft heart towards these three guys. Probably, over time, Nebuchadnezzar had, grown fond of them, or, he probably, felt some pity for them. He also must have thought, we trained them for 3 whole years, our investment will go in waste, if we don't invest time, if we don't, give them another chance. So here, Nebuchadnezzar gives him one more chance because, of his fondness towards them. And he says to them, when you hear the orchestra play, bow down again. And he says to them, what God is there who can deliver you out of my hand? Now in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has just experienced, Daniel interpreting or giving him the dream first and then interpreting it. And, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't think that, Yahweh is, yet that powerful. Can Yahweh, deliver these guys from, this furnace? Can Yahweh deliver them out of his hand? He's probably, deliberately challenging Yahweh. And as I've said before, at a distance, this fire is blazing, but that in an oven, but even looking at that blazing fire, behind them or ahead of them, it did not make these young men, change their minds or bow to the image. We see their reply, in verses 16 to 18, and we'll close with these verses. In verse 16, we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. They said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So the young men responded that they did not, need to present a defense. Literally, it means, they did not need to give an answer to the king. They did not apologize for their behavior. Their their reply was firm, and, their minds were made up. Now, regarding the threat of death, in the furnace, they said, God is able to deliver them. If you look at the NIV translation, I normally don't use the NIV translation, but the NIV translation brings out, what the text is trying to tell us. And here we see the NIV says, "And God will rescue us from your hand, O king." So God will rescue us is in the imperfect tense, okay? And it says he will definitely rescue us. It can also be translated as he may rescue us. So, whatever the situation is, that God was going to rescue them from it. Whether they even went to the furnace or they didn't go, or they had to face any other consequence of their behavior, God was going to intervene in their situation. That's what the text says. So they humbly accepted the fact that even though they were going through the situation, God does not always choose, to intervene miraculously on the behalf of his servants. So this is what the Hebrews, understood, because their reply was that even if he does not rescue us, okay, we will not bow, to this image. So they had understood that, God doesn't always, interpret. Probably when these Hebrew boys were growing up, they probably heard, of how, God had performed miracles for the nation of Israel. They probably heard of, how he parted the sea and, how he performed miracles delivering Israel and Egypt. And they had the same confidence that this God would do the same for them. So they had no doubt that God was able to intervene in the situation. So here's a lesson that I want us guys to learn today. Does God have all the power? Yes. Is God able to deliver believers from all problems and trials? Yes. But does God deliver from all trials? No. God allows trials to come into our lives to build our character. And this happens for a number of reasons. If you want to know more, read Romans chapter 5. It's all mentioned over there. Now, the purpose of trials may not always be understood, but God simply asks that, while the trial is going on, that we trust Him. It is not easy, but we need to trust the Lord. Job chapter 13, verse 15 says that though He slay me, yet I will hope in Him. So, although God does not guarantee that His followers will never suffer or experience that, He does promise always to be with them. In times of trial, we believers should have the attitude of these young men. In some of the most courageous words in the book of Daniel were recorded in verse 18. And this is what it says, I'll repeat it. But even if God does not rescue us, let it be known to you, O King, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, Jesus tells us, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both the soul and the body. So this explains the confidence, exhibited by these three Jewish boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They declare that even if God doesn't do it for us, let it be known to you that we are not going to serve your gods. Even if these three young guys were going to face death or going to die, they were going to face it with courage, knowing that, they were ready to suffer for God. And the past also, in church history, we see that, many people suffered because they faithfully served God. There was nothing that could, move them to the left or to the right.